Detective James Miller rubbed his tired eyes as he stared at the antique music box in the photograph. Mrs. Eleanor Thompson, a wealthy collector of rare musical items, had reported it missing from her mansion just 2 days ago. The box wasn't just any ordinary music box. It was a priceless artifact from the Victorian era, adorned with intricate gold designs and precious gems. "Tell me again what happened that evening, Mrs. Thompson," James asked, studying the elegant woman sitting across from him in her luxurious living room. "As I do every evening, I went to wind up the music box before bed. It plays a beautiful lullaby that helps me sleep," Mrs. Thompson explained, wringing her hands. "But when I entered my study at 10 p.m., it was gone from its usual place on my mahogany desk." James noted that nothing else had been stolen from the house. No signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no picked locks. The security system hadn't been triggered either. It was as if the music box had simply vanished into thin air. "Who else has access to your home, Mrs. Thompson?" "Only my housekeeper, Maria, who's been with me for 15 years, and my nephew, Timothy, who visits occasionally. Oh, and Mr. Roberts, my music box maintenance expert who comes once a month to ensure everything is working properly." James interviewed each person. Maria had been cleaning the kitchen at the time of the theft. Timothy was away at college, confirmed by his dormitory supervisor. Mr. Roberts hadn't visited in 3 weeks. Something wasn't adding up. James decided to examine the study more carefully. The mahogany desk, where the music box usually sat, showed no signs of disturbance. The dust pattern indicated that the box had indeed been there recently. As he was about to leave the study, a faint sound caught his attention. It was barely audible, a tiny mechanical clicking coming from somewhere in the room. Following the sound, James found himself facing a large painting of Mrs. Thompson's late husband. Carefully moving the painting aside revealed a wall safe. The clicking sound was coming from inside. "Mrs. Thompson," James called out, "did you check your safe after the music box disappeared?" Mrs. Thompson hurried into the study, looking confused. "The safe? No, I rarely use it. I keep only old documents in there. Could you open it, please?" Mrs. Thompson hesitated for a moment before entering the combination. As the safe door swung open, the clicking sound grew louder. There, nestled among yellowed papers, was the missing music box, still trying to play its lullaby. "I don't understand," Mrs. Thompson gasped. "How did it get in there?" James noticed something peculiar about Mrs. Thompson's reaction. She seemed more surprised by the fact that the box had been found than relieved to have it back. "Mrs. Thompson, you mentioned you wind up the music box every night before bed. How long does it play?" "About 4 hours," she replied without thinking. "And you discovered it missing at 10 p.m. 2 nights ago?" She nodded. "Then why is it still trying to play now, nearly 48 hours later?" James asked quietly. "Unless it was wound up much more recently." Mrs. Thompson's face paled. I can explain." The truth finally emerged. Mrs. Thompson had been facing financial difficulties. She'd planned to report the music box stolen, collect the insurance money, and then find it later in an antique shop abroad. She'd hidden it in her safe, but forgot that she'd wound it up before putting it away. The music box, continuing to play in the safe, had ultimately given away her scheme. "I never meant to cause such trouble," Mrs. Thompson said, tears rolling down her cheeks. "The bank was threatening to foreclose on my house. I was desperate." James sighed as he made his final notes on the case. Sometimes the mysteries he solved didn't have satisfying endings. Mrs. Thompson would face insurance fraud charges, likely losing the very home she'd been trying to save. As he left the mansion, James could still hear the faint melody of the music box playing its Victorian lullaby. It seemed to him that the song had a sadder tone now, as if it too mourned the unfortunate turn of events that had transformed it from a cherished family heirloom into evidence in a criminal case. The missing music box case was closed, but like many of his cases, it left Detective James Miller with a bittersweet taste. Sometimes the real mystery wasn't in solving the crime, but in understanding the desperate circumstances that drove ordinary people to commit them. He made a mental note to speak with the district attorney about showing leniency in Mrs. Thompson's case. After all, in his years of detective work, he'd learned that justice sometimes needed to be tempered with mercy.